30,000 dead, $81 billion in damage, the costliest natural disaster in American history. For years, those were the numbers scientists used to describe what happens when the Cascadia Fault off the Pacific Northwest finally ruptures. And then a researcher asked a simple question that broke all of them. How could it possibly be worse than that? What he found was a second disaster hidden inside the first, a chain of fire and toxic gas and permanent flooding that the original numbers never counted, in a region 1,000 years behind where it needs to be. He said writing the report kept him awake at night, out of fear. What did he see coming that no one wanted to put on paper? Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. The quietest fault on Earth. There is a stretch of ocean floor off the western edge of the United States that has not made a sound in 325 years. No great tremor, no warning, no release. And that silence is the single most dangerous thing about it. Most people, when they picture an earthquake threat in America, think of California. They picture the San Andreas, the cracked highways, the Hollywood version of the ground splitting open. But the fault that keeps the people who study these things awake at night is not in California at all. It runs offshore of the Pacific Northwest, roughly 700 miles of it, from the northern edge of California up past Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia. It is called the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and when it finally breaks, it is expected to produce the largest earthquake the modern United States has ever felt, followed by what many specialists describe, without drama, as the worst natural disaster in the history of the country. And here is the part that should make you sit up. For years, scientists have understood the broad shape of that disaster. They knew about the shaking, they knew about the wave, they had numbers, grim ones, for how many people would die and how much it would cost. But brand new research has now filled in the part of the picture nobody had finished drawing, the part that comes after the shaking stops. And what it shows is that the aftermath of this earthquake may be even deadlier than the earthquake itself. The fire, the poison, the slow drowning of an entire coastline. We're going to walk through every piece of it tonight, because this is not a story about something that might happen somewhere far away. This is a story about ground that millions of people are standing on right now. I want to be clear about why we are spending a full night on this rather than a quick headline. The Cascadia threat is not a single fact you can absorb in 30 seconds and move past. It is a stack of interlocking dangers, each one feeding the next, and you cannot understand how bad the whole thing is unless you follow the chain link by link. From the silent fault to the spilled fuel, to the burning river, to the drifting cloud, to the sinking coast. Take any one piece out of context and it sounds survivable. Put them together, in the order they will actually happen, and you start to see why the people who study this for a living talk about it the way they do. So we are going to build the picture carefully, the way the scientists built it, one piece of evidence at a time, until the full shape of it is impossible to unsee. To understand why Cascadia is so frightening, you have to understand what it actually is. A subduction zone is a place where two of the giant plates that make up the surface of the Earth are colliding. Off the Pacific Northwest, a smaller plate called the Juan de Fuca plate is sliding underneath the much larger North American plate, diving down beneath the continent at a shallow angle. That collision has been going on for millions of years. It built the mountains. It fuels the volcanoes. It is the engine of the entire region. But right now, at this very moment, the two plates are not sliding smoothly. They are locked, stuck against each other, jammed tight, while the deeper forces keep pushing. And as they stay locked, they bend. They store energy, the way you store energy in a spring when you compress it, or in a ruler when you bend it against the edge of a table. The strain builds and builds and builds year after year, century after century, and one day the lock breaks, and all of that stored energy releases at once. That releases the earthquake, and the longer the fault stays locked, the more energy it has been storing, and the bigger that earthquake becomes. Now here is the strange and sinister thing about Cascadia, the quality that sets it apart from almost every other major fault on the planet. It is quiet, eerily, unnaturally quiet. On a human timescale, year to year, it barely produces any earthquakes at all. There is no steady drumbeat of small tremors out there to remind people that something enormous is waiting underneath them. Other fault systems chatter constantly. They give you little quakes, regular reminders, a background hum of activity. Cascadia gives you almost nothing. It just sits there, locked and loading, saying nothing. To grasp how unusual that is, picture the difference between a kettle that whistles and one that does not. A whistling kettle tells you the pressure is building. You hear it rise and you take it off the heat. Most fault systems whistle. They give off small quakes that let everyone hear the pressure and remember the danger. Cascadia is the kettle with no whistle. The pressure builds exactly the same way, but in silence, so there is no sound to warn the people standing in the kitchen that it is about to blow. And you might think that silence is a good sign. It is the opposite. A fault that releases its energy in frequent small quakes is a fault that is letting off pressure a little at a time. A fault that stays silent for centuries is a fault that is saving all of it up for one catastrophic moment. The quiet is not peace. The quiet is the sound of a fault holding its breath. And that is the central idea I need you to hold on to for the rest of this video, because everything else hangs from it. The deadliest threat here is not loud. It does not announce itself. It is the thing that has been sitting in silence, building, while we forgot it was there. So how do we even know this fault is dangerous if it almost never makes a sound? That is where the story takes a turn that genuinely sounds like fiction. Because the proof that Cascadia can produce a monster did not come from a seismograph, or from a sensor on the ocean floor, or from any modern instrument at all. It came from a stack of paper records written by hand, in another language, on the other side of the entire Pacific Ocean, more than 3 centuries ago. The fault left a signature. We just had to learn how to read it. And once scientists did, the timeline they uncovered did not reassure anyone. It started a countdown. Part 2. The Wave That Had No Earthquake. On a winter night in the year 1699, by the calendar much of the world uses now, the people living along the coast of Japan experienced something that should have been impossible. The sea rose up and came ashore. A tsunami, several feet high, swept into coastal villages, flooded homes, damaged buildings, and then withdrew. And the people who survived it were left with a question that had no answer. Because a tsunami is supposed to come after an earthquake. You feel the ground shake, hard, and then you know to run for high ground. That is the warning. That is the deal. But on this night, there had been no earthquake, no shaking, no warning at all. The ground in Japan had not moved. The wave simply arrived, out of nowhere, in the dark, as if the ocean itself had decided to attack. The Japanese officials of the time were meticulous record keepers, and they wrote it all down. The date, the time, the height of the water, the damage it caused, village by village. They called it, in effect, a wave with no parent, an orphan, a tsunami with no earthquake to call its own. For almost 300 years, that record sat in Japanese archives as a curiosity, a mystery with no solution. Nobody connected it to anything, because how could you connect a flood in Japan to a fault nobody had even identified yet on the far side of the world? And this is the thread I want you to keep pulling on, because it connects directly back to that silent fault we just talked about. The reason Cascadia is so dangerous is precisely that it hides. It does not leave the obvious evidence other faults leave. So the proof of what it can do had to be assembled slowly from clues scattered across the planet. The first clues on the American side were strange forests. Along the coast of Oregon and Washington, in the tidal zones where saltwater meets the land, there are stands of dead cedar trees. Ghost forests, people call them. Trees that are still standing, grey and bare, rooted in soil that is now too salty for them to live in. For a tree to die that way, something had to drop that land down, suddenly, into the reach of the tides, drowning the roots in salt water all at once. And when scientists took core samples from those dead trees and counted and matched their growth rings, the trees all told the same story. They all died at the same time. Their final ring of growth was the same year, the winter of the year 1700. It is worth slowing down on how astonishing that piece of detective work really is, because it is one of the great achievements of earthquake science. Tree rings are a kind of natural calendar. Every year a tree adds a ring, thicker in good years and thinner in hard ones, and the pattern of fat and thin rings across a region forms a signature that scientists can match from tree to tree, like a barcode written in wood. By matching the rings of the dead coastal cedars against living trees and old timbers whose ages were already known, researchers could count backward and pin the death of those drowned forests not just to a decade, but to a single growing season. The trees stopped growing after the summer of 1699 and never grew again. Something killed them all over that winter. That something was the land dropping. When the fault ruptured, the coast subsided, and salt water rushed into soil that had been dry, poisoning the roots of whole forests in one night. The same event that drowned the trees sent the wave toward Japan. So you have three completely independent lines of evidence, gathered by different scientists using entirely different methods, all converging on the same moment. The ghost forests on land, the turbidite landslides under the sea, and the orphan tsunami in the Japanese archives. Three witnesses who never spoke to each other, telling the identical story. And there is a fourth witness, one that was there all along. The native communities of the Pacific Northwest carried the memory of that night in their oral histories, stories of the ground shaking and the ocean rising and swallowing villages, of whole winters of death along the coast. For generations those accounts were treated by outsiders as legend. They were not legend. They were eyewitness testimony, passed down with care across 3 centuries, describing the exact event that the trees and the sediment and the foreign records would later confirm. The people who lived here never forgot. It was the newcomers, building their cities, who did not think to ask or did not believe the answer when they heard it. That gap between the people who remembered and the people who built is its own quiet lesson. Knowledge existed. It simply was not held by the people pouring the foundations and writing the codes, and so it might as well not have existed at all for the purposes of keeping anyone safe. A warning that is not believed is no warning. A memory that is not heeded protects no one. The fault had left its record in the trees, in the sediment, in the stories, in the archives across the ocean, and still the cities rose as if none of it were there. Then the scientist looked offshore, at the layers of sediment on the ocean floor, and found something else. Underwater landslides, layers of jumbled sediment called turbidites, the kind of chaos that only a massive earthquake shaking the seafloor could produce. And those layers, too, lined up with the same moment in time. The dead trees on land and the landslides under the sea were 2 halves of the same event. Something enormous had ruptured along that 700-mile fault, dropped the coastline, shaken the seafloor into avalanches, and launched a wave. And that wave had to go somewhere. It raced west across the open Pacific, thousands of miles of empty ocean, until it reached the only thing standing in its way, the coast of Japan. The orphan tsunami finally had a parent. By working backwards from the Japanese records, knowing how fast a tsunami travels across the Pacific, scientists could do something almost eerie. They could calculate the exact moment the fault broke. Not just the year, the night, the hour. The Cascadia megaquake struck at roughly 9 o'clock at night on January 26th in the year 1700. Sit with that for a second. We are talking about an event that happened before the United States existed, before there were instruments to measure it, before anyone on the American continent who experienced it could write it down in a way that survived. And yet we can name the night it happened, almost to the hour, because a wave crossed an ocean and a careful clerk in Japan wrote down when it arrived. That is not a small thing. That is a fault revealing itself across 300 years and 1 entire ocean. And it tells us something we cannot unknow. This is not a hypothetical. Cascadia has done this before. The only question left is when it does it again, and whether the millions of people now living in its shadow will be ready, or whether they will be just as blindsided as those villagers in the dark. Because once you know the date of the last one, you can start counting forward, and the math is not comforting. Part 3. 325 years of silence. 325 years. That is how long it has been since that night in 1700. And to understand whether that number should frighten you, you need to know the rhythm of this fault, the pattern it has kept over thousands of years of history written in mud and stone. When scientists went looking through the geologic record, digging into coastal marshes and pulling those long cores of sediment from the seafloor, they were able to read Cascadia's diary going back roughly 10,000 years, and what they found was not a clean, predictable schedule. The fault does not break like clockwork, but it does break, again and again. Over those 10,000 years, the Cascadia Subduction Zone has produced more than 40 major earthquakes, and in just the last 7,000 years, around 10 of those were truly enormous, full ruptures of the fault, events over magnitude 8.5, the kind of earthquake that reshapes a coastline. If you average it out, these great quakes come roughly every few hundred years. Sometimes the gap is shorter, sometimes it is much longer. The intervals are irregular, which is exactly what makes this so hard to live with, because irregular does not mean safe. Irregular means you cannot rule out tomorrow. And when you take everything the geologists have learned and turn it into the cold language of probability, you get numbers that have driven the entire emergency planning effort of 3 states. Scientists currently estimate that there is roughly a 1 in 3 chance of a significant Cascadia earthquake in the next 50 years, and there is around a 15% chance in that same window of the truly catastrophic version, a rupture of the entire 700-mile fault at once. 1 in 3. Think about how you treat a 1 in 3 chance in any other part of your life. That is not a remote possibility. That is not a freak event. That is a coin that lands against you far too often to ignore. And the people who study this are not talking about some distant geological future. They are talking about a window that includes the lifetimes of people watching this right now, their children, their own retirement years. It helps to compare that probability to how we treat risk everywhere else in life, because we are strangely inconsistent about it. We buy insurance against house fires that have far less than a 1 in 3 chance of ever happening to us. We wear seatbelts for crashes we will probably never have. We take 1,000 small precautions against unlikely events because the cost of being wrong is too high to gamble on. And yet here is a 1 in 3 chance, over a span of years that many people watching will live to see, of the single worst disaster in the history of the country, and the collective response has been closer to a shrug. The numbers that should terrify us have instead become background noise, a statistic people in the region have heard so often that it has stopped landing. That dulling is itself a danger, and it traces straight back to the silence. A threat that never shows itself struggles to hold our attention. There is no annual reminder, no small quake every few years to keep the fear fresh, so the probability sits on paper, abstract and easy to file away under someday. But someday is not the same as never, and a fault does not consult our sense of urgency before it slips. The 1 in 3 is not a prediction that it will wait 50 years. It is a statement that on any given day inside that window, including today, the rupture is possible. The clock is running whether or not anyone is watching it. And remember the thread running through all of this. The danger is the silence, the energy quietly stored while everyone forgets. 325 years of quiet does not mean the threat has passed. It means the opposite. It means the spring has been compressing for 325 years. The fault has been locked, bending, storing strain that entire time, and it has nowhere to put that energy except into the next rupture. Every year that passes without an earthquake is not a year of safety being banked. It is another year of fuel being added to the fire that has not started yet. There is no mechanism by which the danger drains away on its own short of an actual rupture. The plates do not change their minds. The convergence does not pause. Every single day the Wanda Fuca plate keeps pushing, the lock keeps holding, and the strain keeps climbing by an amount too small to feel but impossible to undo. The only thing that empties the account is the earthquake itself. Until then, the balance only grows. There is a phrase that the researchers and emergency managers in the Pacific Northwest use, almost like a grim mantra. We are due. Not overdue necessarily because the timing is irregular and the fault keeps its own schedule, but due. Squarely inside the window, living on borrowed time that we did not even know we were borrowing until a few decades ago. The phrase due is doing a lot of quiet work, and it is worth being precise about it. Due does not mean tomorrow, and it does not mean 100 years from now. It means inside the window, with the timing genuinely unknowable, which is the most uncomfortable status a threat can have. A danger with a known date can be scheduled around. A danger that is clearly far off can be deferred. But a danger that is simply due, that could come this year or in 50, gives us no comfortable place to file it, and so most people file it nowhere at all, which is exactly how a region ends up unprepared for something everyone technically knows is coming. And that last point is the one that turns this from a natural hazard into something far more troubling, something with our fingerprints all over it. Because for most of the time that cities and towns and bridges and fuel tanks were being built across the Pacific Northwest, nobody knew this fault existed at all. The people who built the modern Pacific Northwest were building on top of a loaded gun, and they had no idea it was there. They poured the foundations, ran the pipelines, stacked the fuel tanks on the riverbanks, all without knowing that the ground beneath them was going to one day try to tear itself apart. To understand how an entire region ended up so dangerously exposed, we have to look at just how recently we figured out the truth and how much was already built by the time we did. Part 4. The cities we built on a secret. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is, scientifically speaking, a recent discovery, and that single fact explains almost everything about why the coming disaster will be so severe. The native communities who have lived along this coast for thousands of years knew. Their oral histories carry the memory of a night when the ground shook and the ocean rose and swallowed villages whole. The knowledge was there, passed down through generations in the stories of the people who were there for the last one. But the scientific establishment, the people writing the building codes and approving the construction permits, did not begin to piece the mystery together until the 1980s. That is not a typo. We're talking about a threat that modern science only really started to take seriously within the lifetimes of many people watching right now. And to understand why that timing is a catastrophe in its own right, you have to think about what had already been built by the 1980s. Entire cities, Portland, Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia, hundreds of towns, thousands of miles of highway and rail, bridges over every river, ports, airports, hospitals, schools, water systems, gas lines, and the fuel infrastructure that keeps all of it running. All of it designed, approved, and constructed by engineers who had no idea that the single largest earthquake in the history of the country was going to one day rip through the region. They built for wind, they built for rain, they built for ordinary loads and ordinary lifetimes. They did not build for a magnitude 9. Some of the most vulnerable structures in the Pacific Northwest are more than 100 years old. They were put up decades before the theory of plate tectonics was even accepted science. Think about what that means. The very idea that the continents move, that the ground is made of sliding plates that grind and lock and release, did not exist as accepted fact when some of these buildings went up. The people who built them were not cutting corners. They were not negligent. They simply lived in a world that had not yet discovered the danger. They were building blind, and we inherited what they built. To make this concrete, think about the specific kinds of structures that fill an older American city, because not all buildings fail the same way. The most dangerous are often the old ones made of unreinforced brick and stone, masonry buildings with no steel skeleton to hold them together when the walls start to move. In a long, violent shake, the walls of these buildings can peel away and collapse outward into the street, and there are thousands of them across the Pacific Northwest, many still in daily use as shops, apartments, and schools. Then there are the so-called soft-story buildings, the ones with a weak open ground floor, a row of garage doors or storefront glass, holding up several heavier floors above. When the shaking hits, that weak first floor can simply fold, pancaking the building down onto whatever was parked or standing beneath it. Now multiply that by the scale of an entire region. Every bridge a commuter crosses without a thought, every overpass on every highway, the pipes that carry the water and the gas, the wires and substations of the electrical grid, the rail lines, the port cranes, the airport runways and towers. A great many of these were designed in an era that did not know a magnitude 9 was possible here, and retrofitting them all is a project measured in decades and in sums of money that make politicians flinch. Some of it has been done. Critical bridges have been strengthened, newer buildings have gone up to far better codes, and the awareness that did not exist in the 1970s is real now. But the backlog is enormous, and the fault does not wait for the budget to catch up. This is the quiet tragedy underneath the loud one. The earthquake will be sudden, but the vulnerability it exploits was built slowly, deliberately, by good people doing their best in a world that had not yet learned the truth. We are not being punished for recklessness. We are being handed the bill for a knowledge gap, a stretch of history when the most important fact about the ground was simply unknown. And the longer we wait to close that gap, the larger the bill grows. It gets worse when you look at where they built. Cities grow toward water. They always have. Water is transport, commerce, life. So the most valuable, most developed land tends to be the low-lying ground right along the rivers and the coast. And that is precisely the ground that behaves the worst in a great earthquake. The soft, loose, water-saturated soil of a riverbank or a filled-in waterfront is the most sensitive there is to violent shaking and to the sudden drop in land level that a subduction quake brings. We did not just build before we understood the threat. We concentrated our most important, most dangerous infrastructure on exactly the patch of ground that the threat will punish hardest. There is a bitter irony in how rational each of those choices felt at the time. Building near the water gave cities transport and commerce and growth. Putting the fuel terminals on the riverbank made the fuel cheap to move. Filling in low, marshy ground created flat, buildable land right where the economy wanted it. Every one of those decisions was sensible by the logic of its day, and every one of them quietly increased the toll of an earthquake that the decision-makers did not know was coming. That is the cruelty of building during the silence. It was not that people ignored a warning. There was no warning to ignore. The danger was being multiplied invisibly, one reasonable choice at a time, by people who would have built differently in an instant if they had only known what we know now. And this is the connection back to the silence, the thread that ties this whole story together. The fault stayed quiet, so we forgot to be afraid, so we built without restraint in all the wrong places. The quiet did not just hide the fault, it shaped the cities. It let an entire civilization grow up directly on top of the hazard, unprotected, because the hazard never spoke up to warn us. The danger and our exposure to it grew together, in the dark, for a century. That phrase, growing together in the dark, is the truest summary of how the Pacific Northwest arrived at this moment. The hazard was always there, fixed by geology, waiting. What changed over the last century was us, pouring more and more of our lives onto the ground above it, raising the stakes of the eventual rupture without ever meaning to. Because the information that would have made us build differently simply did not arrive until most of the building was already done, so now we have the setup. A monster fault, silent and loaded, due for a rupture that statistics say could come in our lifetimes, sitting beneath cities that were built without the faintest idea it was there. The question is no longer whether this is dangerous. The question is what exactly happens when it lets go. And for years, when scientists answered that question, they started in the same place. They started with the shaking. So let us start there too, because you cannot understand the new horror without first understanding the old one. And the old one is terrifying enough on its own. Part 5. 6 minutes that feel like forever. When the Cascadia fault finally breaks, the first thing that arrives is the shaking, and it is unlike anything most people have ever imagined an earthquake to be. Most earthquakes people experience, even strong ones, are over in seconds. A sharp jolt, some violent rolling, and then it stops. Your body barely has time to react before it is finished. A full rupture of Cascadia is a different category of event entirely, because of how big the fault is. 700 miles of locked plate boundary does not break all at once in an instant. It unzips. The rupture tears along the fault mile after mile, and as it travels it keeps feeding energy into the ground. And that means the shaking does not last seconds, it lasts minutes, 3 minutes, 4, as long as 5 or 6 minutes of continuous violent ground motion. Try to actually feel how long that is. Count it out in your head sometime. 6 minutes is an eternity when the floor will not stop moving, when you cannot stand, when everything around you is failing. The people who have lived through long subduction earthquakes describe it the same way every time. It feels like it will never end. It feels like the world itself has broken and forgotten how to be still. The reason the duration matters so much is not only psychological, it is structural. Buildings, bridges and pipelines do not usually fail the instant the shaking starts. They fail from accumulated punishment, from being flexed and stressed and cracked over and over until something gives way. A short, sharp quake might rattle a building hard but leave it standing because the shaking stops before the damage compounds. A quake that goes on for minutes works at a structure relentlessly, finding every weakness, widening every crack, until even buildings that survived the first 30 seconds come apart in the 3rd or 4th minute. Duration is its own form of violence, and Cascadia delivers more of it than almost any earthquake people in the lower states will ever experience. The acceleration is the other half of the threat, and that figure of 1g deserves to be understood, not just heard. 1g is the acceleration of gravity itself, the same force that holds you in your chair right now. When the ground accelerates sideways at 1g, it is yanking the earth out from under everything as forcefully as gravity pulls down. That is what it means to throw a car into the air, to lift a person off the floor. Objects do not slide, they jump. Furniture becomes airborne. Anything heavy and unsecured turns into a projectile, and for a person caught in it, even standing becomes impossible almost immediately, which is exactly why the official guidance is to drop to the ground and take cover at the first hard jolt, because in another second or two you will be on the ground whether you chose it or not. Picture it playing out in a tall building in one of the cities. The structure begins to sway, slowly at first, then harder, the sway building with each cycle as the long shaking pumps energy into it. Anything on wheels rolls and slams, bookshelves and cabinets walk across the floor and topple. The lights fail as the grid goes down, so this is all happening in sudden darkness or in the grey light through windows that may themselves be cracking, and it does not stop. The people inside have to simply endure it, holding on for minutes that feel like hours, with no way to know whether the building they are in is one of the ones that will stand or one of the ones that will not. That is the opening act of the Cascadia earthquake, and the wave is already coming. Along the coast, closest to the fault, the intensity is almost beyond belief. The shaking there could exceed 1G. That is a technical way of saying the ground accelerates hard enough to throw things into the air, strong enough to lift cars off the road, strong enough to lift a person clean off the ground, not shake them, launch them. And that goes on not for a moment but for minutes. Anything not bolted down, and a great many things that are, will not survive that. The major cities sit a little inland, slightly farther from the fault, and they get what sounds like a break. The shaking there is somewhat less severe than at the coast, but that mercy is an illusion because of what the cities contain. The coast has relatively few people. The cities have millions. The cities have the old brick buildings, the bridges, the overpasses, the elevated highways, the water mains, the electrical substations, the natural gas network, the fuel pipelines, the rail lines, the ports, the airports. They have the entire dense machinery of modern life, almost none of which was designed specifically to tolerate this kind of shaking for this long. And so, when the ground moves, that machinery starts to fail, all at once, across an area the size of several states. Bridges and overpasses can buckle and drop. Older buildings can collapse outright. Water systems rupture, which means that in the moments after the quake, when fires start, there may be no water in the pipes to fight them. The natural gas network cracks and begins to leak, and the electrical grid, the thing every other system depends on, goes down across the entire impacted region. Not a neighbourhood, not a city, the whole zone, dark at once. I want you to hold that image, because it matters for everything that comes later. We would expect a blackout across the entire affected area, and not a blackout measured in hours or days. Some estimates put the power outage for parts of the region at 6 months to a year. Imagine your city, and every city around it, without electricity, without reliable water, with bridges down and roads blocked, not for a long weekend, but for the better part of a year. That is the baseline. That is before we get to the wave, before we get to the fire, before we get to the poison. That is just the shaking and what it leaves behind. And here is the thread again, the thing I keep coming back to. None of this infrastructure failed because anyone was reckless. It failed because it was built during the silence, in the long quiet when nobody knew the fault was there. The blackout, the broken bridges, the empty water pipes, they are all the delayed cost of a hazard that stayed hidden while we built on top of it. But the shaking, as bad as it is not the part that kills the most people. Because while the ground is still moving far out at sea, the second disaster has already launched, and it is racing toward the shore faster than any warning can travel. Part 6. The water comes next. While the coast is still shaking, the ocean is already coming, and for the people closest to the fault there may be only minutes to understand what that means before it arrives. When the Cascadia fault ruptures, it does not just shake, it moves the seafloor itself. The leading edge of the North American plate, which has been bent and held down by the locked fault, suddenly springs back and lurches upward, and when a slab of seafloor that large jumps, it shoves the entire column of water above it. That displaced water has to go somewhere, and it spreads outward as a tsunami, a series of waves carrying an almost unimaginable amount of energy. For people on the open ocean side, the wave heads west toward Japan, the same path it took in 1700. But a huge amount of that energy also goes straight at the nearest shore, the coastline of the Pacific Northwest. And here is the cruel part. Because the fault is so close to that coast, the wave does not have far to travel. For people living right along the coastline nearest the rupture, the delay between the earthquake and the tsunami could be as short as 10 to 15 minutes. Think about what that actually demands of a human being. The ground has just shaken violently for several minutes. You are disoriented, maybe injured, maybe trapped, surrounded by the sound of things collapsing. And in the middle of that chaos, you have to understand instantly that the shaking itself was the only warning you're going to get, and that you now have 10 or 15 minutes at most to get to high ground before a wall of water arrives. There is no time for an official alert to reach you and for you to react. The shaking is the alert. If you feel a long, hard earthquake near that coast, the water is already on its way, and the only correct response is to move uphill immediately and not stop. The run-up, the height the water reaches as it surges onto land, could reach up to 100 feet in places. 100 feet of water driving inland, carrying everything it picks up. Cars, trees, the wreckage of buildings, all of it turned into battering rams. Low-lying coastal towns would be inundated, and tsunamis, again and again throughout history, have proven to be the single deadliest part of a subduction earthquake. Not the shaking, the water. The physics of why the tsunami is so deadly comes down to what water carries. A wall of water, even a few feet high, moving at speed, contains an astonishing amount of force, far more than wind of the same speed, because water is so much heavier than air. A tsunami is not a tall breaking wave like the ones surfers ride. It is more like the sea itself suddenly rising and surging inland as a fast-moving flood that does not stop at the beach, pushing forward for a long way, carrying boats, cars, buildings and debris along with it, and then dragging all of that back out as it withdraws, often killing as many people on the way out as on the way in. The water does not have to be 100 feet high everywhere to be lethal. Even the lower surges, 10 or 20 feet, are unsurvivable for anyone caught in the open. This is why the inundation zones, the areas a tsunami can reach, are mapped and marked along the Pacific Northwest coast, and why knowing whether you're standing in one could decide whether you live. In many coastal towns there are signs showing evacuation routes, lines on the road marking where the danger zone ends, and high ground designated as the place to run. The whole survival strategy rests on time, and there is almost none. With the wave possibly arriving in 10 to 15 minutes, there is no waiting for a phone alert, no time to gather belongings, no second guessing. The shaking is the siren. The instant a long, strong quake ends near that coast, the only correct move is to climb on foot, as high as you can, as fast as you can, and to keep going until you are well above and behind the marked zone. If you live along that coast, or if you vacation there often, this is the one piece of this entire video that could directly save your life. So let me be plain about it. The plan is not complicated, but it has to be automatic. A long, strong earthquake near the coast means move to high ground on foot, right away, without waiting for anyone to tell you to. We have broken down tsunami survival in more detail before, and if you are in one of these zones, it is worth knowing cold, because in the real event there will be no time to learn it. The cruelty of a near-field tsunami is that it removes the one resource every other warning system depends on, which is time. Distant tsunamis, the kind generated thousands of miles away, give coastlines hours to react, time for sirens and alerts and orderly evacuation. Cascadia gives the nearest communities minutes. There is no version of the official warning chain that moves faster than a wave already that close. The decision has to be made by each person instantly on the strength of the shaking alone, which is why it has to be rehearsed until it is reflex rather than thought. Now, when you add the tsunami to the shaking, you start to get the casualty and damage estimates that planners have worked with for years. More than 30,000 people killed. More than $81 billion in damage. By those numbers alone, the Cascadia earthquake would be the costliest natural disaster ever to strike the United States. And it is worth pausing on the fact that those figures, the 30,000 lives and the $81 billion, were for a long time considered the complete picture, the worst case fully accounted for. Planners worked from them. Officials cited them. They were the headline numbers that defined how bad people believed the Cascadia disaster could be. The whole thrust of the newer research is that these supposedly worst-case figures were never the ceiling at all. They were only the part of the disaster that the shaking and the wave produced directly, before the fuel and the fire and the gas and the sinking coast add their own separate tolls on top. The deadliest, the most expensive, the worst we have ever faced. And for a long time, that was where the story ended. 30,000 dead, 81 billion gone, the worst disaster in American history. And then a researcher started asking a different question. Not how bad is the earthquake, but what happens in the hours and days after the shaking stops, in the wreckage, when the fires start and the chemicals leak and the resources to fight any of it are simply gone. And the answer he found was so disturbing that he said it kept him awake at night. Because it turns out the 30,000 dead and the $81 billion might not be the worst of it. They might only be the beginning. The shaking and the wave are the natural disaster. What comes next is the one we built ourselves. Part 7. Where the real disaster begins. The costliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. That was the conclusion for years. 30,000 lives, $81 billion. And then someone asked a question that turned that conclusion into a floor instead of a ceiling. How, the researcher wondered, could it possibly be worse than that? And the answer he uncovered was so heavy that, in his own words, he stayed up many nights while he was writing his report out of fear. To find the part of the story that everyone had missed, you have to leave the coast and the open ocean behind and travel inland, to the banks of a river running through the middle of one of the region's largest cities. Along the Willamette River, just a couple of miles from downtown Portland, Oregon, there sits a cluster of industrial sites that almost nobody outside of emergency planning circles has ever heard of. On the maps and in the reports, it is called the Critical Energy Infrastructure Hub. People who work on this just call it the hub, and it is, quietly, one of the most dangerous places in the entire Pacific Northwest. What makes the hub so unsettling is how invisible it is to the people who depend on it. Most residents of Oregon have never heard its name, never driven past it with any sense of what they were looking at, never considered that the gasoline in their tank and the jet fuel at their airport and the diesel in the trucks that stock their grocery stores all funnel through one narrow strip of riverbank. It is the kind of infrastructure that is everywhere in its effects and nowhere in public awareness, the plumbing of modern life tucked out of sight until the day it fails. And it grew up where it did for ordinary economic reasons. Fuel arrives by pipeline, barge and rail, and the riverbank was the convenient place to receive it, store it, and send it back out. Each individual decision made sense in its moment. The collective result is a single point of failure for the energy supply of an entire state, sitting on the worst possible ground in the path of the worst possible earthquake. Concentration like that is efficient right up until the moment it is catastrophic. In normal times, having all the fuel move through one well-connected hub keeps costs down and distribution simple. But it also means there is no redundancy, no backup, no second system to take over if the first one is destroyed. When the hub fails in the megaquake, it does not just spill and burn. It takes the region's fuel supply down with it at the exact moment that fuel becomes most desperately needed for the generators, the emergency vehicles, the trucks that would carry in relief. The same concentration that made the fuel cheap to move in peacetime makes its loss devastating in disaster. We did not just store the danger in one place. We staked the region's ability to respond on the survival of the very facility most likely to be destroyed. Here is why it matters so much. Roughly 90% of the liquid fuel that the entire state of Oregon depends on flows through this one narrow strip of land along the river. Jet fuel for the airports, gasoline for the cars, diesel for the trucks that carry the food, heating oil, lubricants, the lifeblood of a modern economy. It arrives, it is stored in enormous tanks, and it is distributed out across the state from this single choke point. If you wanted to design the most fragile possible arrangement for a region's energy supply, you would be hard-pressed to do better than putting almost all of it in one place, on a riverbank, in an earthquake zone. And these are not small tanks. These are huge cylinders of stored fuel, towering containers holding everything from jet fuel to gasoline to diesel, lined up along the soft ground at the edge of the water. The problem is not just that they are all in one place. The problem is when and how they were built. Many of these large petroleum tanks were constructed to seismic standards that we now know are badly insufficient. A significant share of them went up before 1970. They were built, in other words, during the silence we keep coming back to. Built before anyone understood that a magnitude 9 was coming for them. Built to survive an ordinary world, not the one that is actually waiting. That single idea, infrastructure built for an ordinary world facing an extraordinary one, is the thread that runs under every part of this disaster. The tanks, the bridges, the buildings, the pipes, the chemical stores, all of them were sized for normal life, for the everyday loads and ordinary decades they were expected to see. None of them were sized for the one abnormal afternoon that geology has been preparing for centuries. The mismatch between what we built for and what is actually coming is the whole disaster in a sentence. For years, planners have known this site was a serious threat in a megaquake. That part is not new. What the new research revealed was a far more disturbing and specific picture of exactly what would happen when the shaking hit that riverbank, and how the failure of these tanks would set off a chain reaction that reaches far beyond the fuel itself. When the researcher and his team started digging into the details, one of the first things they discovered was that crucial information was simply missing. There were gaps in the record of what was actually being stored there, and in what quantities. And that gap, that not knowing, is part of what makes the place so dangerous. Uncertainty in hazard planning is not neutral. When you do not know exactly what is stored somewhere or in what amount, you cannot size the response, you cannot warn the right neighbourhoods, you cannot stage the right resources, and you cannot even tell the public honestly how much risk they are carrying. The missing inventory at the hub is not just a paperwork problem. It is a hole in the middle of every plan that would otherwise be built to protect the people who live around it. But to understand why a row of fuel tanks on a riverbank becomes a mass casualty event rather than just an expensive mess, you have to understand the specific way the ground beneath them fails. It is not enough to say the ground shakes. Something stranger and more violent happens to that particular kind of soil when a great earthquake hits it. The solid ground these tanks are standing on can, for a few critical minutes, stop being solid at all. And that thread, the soft ground at the water's edge that we built our most dangerous infrastructure on, runs straight back to the core of this whole story. We did not just store the poison and the fuel in one place. We stored it on the one kind of ground that turns to liquid when the fault lets go. Part 8. The tanks on the river. To see why the hub is a catastrophe waiting to happen, you have to look closely at the ground it stands on, because the danger is not really in the tanks. It is in the dirt underneath them. Soil along rivers and waterways is some of the worst possible ground to build on when it comes to earthquakes. It is young, loose, sandy, and saturated with water because it sits right at the level of the river. For everyday purposes, it is perfectly fine. You can build on it, pave it, stack heavy things on it, and it holds. It feels as solid as any other ground. But that solidity is conditional. It depends on the grains of sand staying packed together, with the friction between them holding the whole structure up, and a great earthquake destroys exactly that. This is where we have to talk about the single most important word in the second half of this story: liquefaction. It is the process where loose, sandy, waterlogged soil, when it's shaken hard enough for long enough, temporarily turns into a liquid. The violent shaking jolts the grains of sand apart, the water between them takes the pressure, and the friction that was holding everything together vanishes. For those few minutes, the ground stops behaving like a solid and starts behaving like a thick, heavy fluid. And a liquid cannot hold anything up. It cannot support a building, so the building tears itself apart or sinks or tips. And it cannot hold down something buried either. A pipeline or a tank that is partly underground can actually pop up out of the liquefied soil, floating to the surface like a cork held underwater and suddenly released. This is not a theoretical curiosity. It has happened dramatically in real earthquakes around the world, and the images are unforgettable for the engineers who study them. In Niigata, Japan, in 1964, an earthquake liquefied the ground beneath a complex of apartment buildings, and entire buildings tipped over and lay down on their sides, fully intact, like toys knocked over by a child, because the soil beneath them had turned to liquid and could no longer hold them upright. In Christchurch, New Zealand, in 2011, liquefaction pushed so much wet sand and water up through the ground that whole neighbourhoods were buried in grey muck, with sewer pipes and manhole structures floating up out of the streets. The ground did not just shake, it boiled. It spat up sand and water in fountains, and it swallowed what was built on it. Now bring that back to the riverbank in Portland. The hub is sitting on precisely the kind of young, loose, saturated soil that behaves this way. When the shaking comes, the ground under those fuel tanks can be expected to liquefy, and the consequences stack on top of each other in a way that is almost designed to fail catastrophically. The tanks can settle unevenly as the ground gives way beneath one side, tilting and tearing at their seams. Pipes connecting the tanks, the very plumbing that moves the fuel, can snap as the ground shifts and flows. Buried lines can float up and rupture, and all of this is happening while the fuel inside is sloshing violently from the shaking, hammering at the tank walls from the inside even as the ground attacks from below. It is the simultaneity that makes it so dangerous. Any one of these failures on its own might be containable. A single cracked tank, a single broken pipe, is the kind of industrial accident that emergency crews train for. But Cascadia does not produce single failures. It produces all of them at once, across an entire facility, across many facilities, at the same moment that the bridges are dropping and the water mains are bursting and the power is going out region-wide. The defences that exist assume one thing goes wrong at a time. The earthquake makes everything go wrong together. That is the difference between an accident and a catastrophe, and it is written into the very soil the hub was built on. Now picture that happening underneath the hub. The fault ruptures. The shaking begins and goes on, not for seconds but for minutes, and along that riverbank the ground holding up almost all of Oregon's fuel supply turns to liquid. Remember the duration we talked about, those endless 3 to 6 minutes. That is not just a number. That is how long the soil is being churned, how long the tanks are being shaken on top of ground that has lost its strength. And while the ground is failing beneath them, the tanks themselves are in trouble from the shaking directly. The fuel inside them sloshes, violently, a heavy wave of liquid slamming back and forth against the tank walls. That sloshing alone can tear a tank open. The ground failing underneath, the soil liquefying, the structures tilting and rupturing, all of it stacks together and multiplies the damage at these enormous fuel facilities. And here is the number that should stop you cold. When the researchers modelled what happens, they concluded that something on the order of 50% of the material stored at the hub could be spilled. Half of it, released, and not slowly. To grasp the scale, think of one of the worst environmental disasters in American memory, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the one that fouled the Gulf of Mexico. That spill played out over months, a slow-motion catastrophe that the whole country watched unfold over an entire summer. The hub could release a comparable volume of petroleum, but not over months. It would happen in minutes, like that. An entire Deepwater Horizon dumped into the middle of a major American city in the time it takes the ground to stop shaking. And once that fuel is loose, the disaster is no longer about the earthquake at all. The shaking is already over. The wave may already have come and gone, but now there is an ocean of petroleum loose on a liquefied riverbank in the middle of Portland, flowing toward the water, and the next stage of the catastrophe is just getting started. Because spilled fuel on a river does not simply sit there and wait to be cleaned up. It moves, it spreads, and it burns. The thread we have followed from the beginning, the hidden danger built up during the silence, is about to turn from a spill into a firestorm, and there will be almost nothing left to stop it. Part 9. When the ground turns to liquid. Once half the fuel at the hub is loose, the river itself becomes the delivery system for the next disaster, and the next disaster is fire. Petroleum spilled along the Willamette does not stay put. It flows with the water, spreading downstream, riding the current, and a slick of fuel on a river is a fire waiting for a spark in a moment when sparks are everywhere. Remember what is happening across the city at this exact time. Gas lines are cracked and leaking. Electrical systems are failing and shorting. Buildings are collapsing, throwing up friction and flame. In the middle of all that, a river coated in jet fuel and gasoline does not stay unlit for long, and once it catches, you have something almost medieval in its horror. A river on fire carrying flames downstream, spreading the burn wherever the fuel has reached. And a fire on moving water is almost impossible to fight by the usual means. You cannot build a fire break across a river. You cannot easily smother flames that are riding a current, spreading as fast as the water flows, reaching new fuel and new banks with every minute. A spill fire on the Willamette would not sit politely in one place waiting to be extinguished. It would travel, carrying the disaster downstream to places that felt the earthquake, but thought they had escaped the worst of it. That fire could travel with the spill toward the coast, and it could reach up into the hills that rise right above the hub. And this is where the geography of Portland turns a fuel fire into something far larger, because sitting on those hills is one of the largest urban forests in the entire country. Forest Park stretches across roughly 5,200 acres of trees right at the edge of the city. On any ordinary day, it is one of the things that makes Portland beautiful. In the aftermath of a megaquake, it becomes fuel. A fire spreading off the river and into that much forest, under the right conditions, could grow rapidly into an urban wildfire threatening the tens of thousands of people who live in and around those hills. Estimates put the number of people who could be threatened by such a fire on the order of 70,000. And now ask the question that makes this so much worse than an ordinary wildfire. Who puts it out? In a normal fire, even a bad one, you have firefighters, engines, aircraft, water, a functioning network of roads to move all of it around. In the aftermath of the Cascadia earthquake, none of that is reliable. The water mains are broken, so there may be no water in the hydrants. The bridges are down and the roads are buckled, so the engines cannot get where they need to go. The crews are stretched impossibly thin across a disaster zone the size of several states, dealing with collapse and casualties everywhere at once. The resources that would normally stop a wildfire simply will not be there. A fire that on a normal day would be fought and contained could instead burn more or less freely, because the entire system that fights fires has been knocked flat by the same earthquake that started it. And the people who would normally fight that fire face an impossible math problem. Even where crews can reach a blaze, the demands on them will be everywhere at once. Fires igniting across the city from broken gas lines and downed wires, collapsed buildings with people trapped inside, casualties needing rescue on every block. A fire department, even a good one, is sized for the ordinary day, for a handful of emergencies at a time, not for an entire region failing simultaneously. In the aftermath of the megaquake, every resource is needed in 10 places at once, and the river fire, enormous and spreading, is competing for those same trucks and crews and that same vanished water, with every other catastrophe unfolding in the same hours. Triage becomes the only option, and a fire that grows beyond a certain size simply cannot be a priority when there are living people to pull from the rubble elsewhere. This is the pattern that defines the whole second half of this story, and it is worth saying out loud. Every one of these disasters makes the others worse. The shaking breaks the water system, which means the fire cannot be fought. The shaking liquefies the ground, which spills the fuel, which feeds the fire. The shaking drops the bridges, which strands the firefighters. It is not a list of separate problems. It is a single chain reaction, each link pulling the next, all of it set off by one fault, finally releasing the strain it stored during 325 years of silence. History keeps teaching this same lesson, and we keep half forgetting it. The deadliest part of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake was not the shaking, but the 3 days of fire that followed, fed by broken gas lines and left unchecked because the water mains had failed. In the 1923 earthquake that struck the Tokyo region, the greatest loss of life came from firestorms that swept through dense neighborhoods, killing far more people than the collapse of buildings did. Over and over, in disaster after disaster, the secondary catastrophe, the fire, the flood, the disease, the chemical release, has outdone the earthquake itself. The shaking is the trigger. The cascade is the killer. It is one of the most consistent and most ignored patterns in the entire history of natural disasters. Cascadia takes that pattern and amplifies it with everything modern industry has added to the equation. The cities of 1906 and 1923 did not have a hub holding 90% of a region's fuel on liquefiable ground. They did not have tanks of chlorine and ammonia waiting to form lethal clouds. The basic logic, that the aftermath kills more than the quake, was already proven a century ago, and we have spent that century building exactly the kind of infrastructure that makes the aftermath worse. The river of fire is not a new kind of disaster. It is the oldest kind, the fire after the quake, scaled up to match the size of what we have built and stored along the water, and even the river of fire is not the end of it, because the same shaking that spills the fuel and feeds the flames also breaches a different set of tanks, holding things far more sinister than gasoline. While the fire spreads through the hills, something invisible begins to drift across the neighborhoods below. Not flame, not water, a cloud, and unlike the fire, you cannot see it coming, and you cannot outrun what you cannot see. Part 10. The Cloud. Nobody can outrun. A fire you can at least see. You can watch which way it is spreading. You can, if the roads are open and the warning comes in time, try to move away from it. The next threat gives you none of that, because the next threat is invisible, and by the time you know it is there, it may already be too late. The tanks along that riverbank do not only hold petroleum. The hub and the industrial zone around it store a far wider array of substances, and some of them are not flammable. They are poisonous. We are talking about chemicals like anhydrous ammonia and chlorine gas, along with a whole catalogue of industrial compounds that share one terrible property. When they are released into the air, they become a toxic inhalation hazard. They are not a fire you flee from. They are an atmosphere you cannot breathe. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand how these chemicals kill. Chlorine gas is heavier than air, which means when it escapes, it does not rise and disperse harmlessly into the sky. It sinks. It hugs the ground and pools in low areas and flows downhill, following the same terrain that water would, seeping into exactly the places people shelter. It attacks the lungs directly, and even moderate exposure can be incapacitating. Anhydrous ammonia is its own kind of nightmare, intensely caustic, searing the eyes and the airways of anyone caught in the plume. These are not exotic, rare substances. They are common industrial chemicals stored in bulk in tanks that sit on the same liquefiable ground, shaken by the same earthquake, vulnerable to the same failure as everything else along that river. So picture the full sequence now. The fault ruptures. The ground beneath the industrial zone liquefies. Tanks tip, rupture, and fail the same way the fuel tanks do. But where the fuel becomes a spill and then a fire, these chemicals become a gas, and the gas forms a cloud, and the cloud begins to move. And which way it moves, and how far and how long it lingers, all depends on something no one can control and no one can schedule: the weather. This is the part of the new research that is genuinely chilling in its precision. The team did not just say a toxic release is possible, they modelled it. They focused on 4 of the highest risk facilities, and they built different scenarios based on the most likely wind patterns over the city, asking a simple and horrifying question. When these tanks fail, where does the poison go, and who is standing in its path? And the answer depends heavily on the conditions on the day the earthquake happens to strike. The deadliest conditions are not a storm, they are the opposite. The worst case is a calm, hot summer day, the kind of stagnant, windless afternoon when the air just sits there and does not move. On a windy day, a toxic cloud at least disperses, thins out, blows away. But on a still summer day, the gas lingers. It pools over the neighbourhoods and does not leave. It sits, concentrated and lethal, over the exact areas where people are trapped in the rubble, unable to move, unable to escape. And under those deadliest conditions, the modelling found that more than 2,500 people could die from toxic gas exposure alone. Not from the shaking, not from the wave, not from the fire, from breathing the air, and hundreds of thousands more could be affected, sickened, injured, exposed. Exposure on that scale overwhelms a medical system that is itself part of the disaster. The hospitals are shaking in the same earthquake, losing power in the same blackout, cut off by the same broken bridges. The very places people would go to be treated for chemical exposure may be damaged, dark, and unreachable. So the toxic cloud does not just create casualties, it creates them at the precise moment the capacity to treat them has collapsed, which is the grim signature of this entire disaster, danger, and the loss of every defense against it arriving together in the same few minutes from the same single cause. 2,500 dead from the gas. Layer that on top of the more than 30,000 from the shaking and the tsunami, and you start to see why the researcher could not sleep. Every layer of this disaster adds more bodies, and the layers we're talking about now, the fire and the gas, are the ones almost no one had accounted for. And it gets more specific and more human the closer you look. There are particular places that sit in an almost unimaginably dangerous position. The people of the Linton neighbourhood, down along the river, and the people living up in the hills of Forest Park above the industrial zone are caught in a terrible bind. They are close to the sources of the gas, and the geography that surrounds them, the river on one side and the steep forested hills on the other, with bridges that may be down and roads that may be buckled, means the evacuation challenges are going to be fierce. One of the researchers described this area as one of the most risky places in the entire state of Oregon. Not because the people there did anything wrong, simply because of where the map placed their homes in relation to a hazard that was assembled tank by tank during the long silence when no one knew the fault was there. It is worth being clear about what these scenarios actually involve, because the phrase toxic cloud can sound abstract until you picture the reality. A release of chlorine forms a low, drifting bank of greenish gas that follows the ground, and anyone who breathes a high enough concentration suffers chemical burns to the lungs, drowning slowly in their own fluids. Ammonia in a concentrated release sears the eyes and the throat and can incapacitate a person in moments. These are not slow, subtle poisons. They are fast, and in the chaos after a megaquake, with hospitals damaged, roads blocked, and emergency services overwhelmed, the medical response that might normally save an exposed person may simply not arrive in time. The cloud does not need to be enormous to be lethal. It only needs to drift over a populated area and stay there. And staying there is exactly what the worst-case weather allows. The reason a hot, still summer day is the nightmare scenario is that the air becomes a lid. Without wind to scatter the gas and without the vertical mixing that cooler, more turbulent air provides, the plume just hangs in place, settling into the low neighbourhoods and refusing to thin out. The people in its path cannot necessarily see it, cannot outrun what they cannot locate, and may not even understand that the air itself has become the threat until they are already breathing it. The researchers built their models precisely to capture this, running the likely wind patterns over the city and asking where the gas would go under each one, and the deadliest answers all involve that stagnant, windless heat. What makes the human geography so cruel is that the people most exposed are also the people least able to leave. Those living down in the riverside neighbourhoods are close to the sources and low in the terrain where heavy gas collects. Those up in the forested hills face roads that wind and narrow and may be blocked by landslides or downed trees or the fire itself. Surrounded by water on one side and steep slopes on the other, with bridges potentially down, the routes out are few and fragile exactly where the danger is greatest. These are ordinary families in ordinary homes who happen to live at the unlucky intersection of soft ground, stored poison, and bad escape routes, an intersection drawn not by them, but by a century of industrial decisions made without the fault in mind. And remember, this is the thread that ties everything together. The shaking does not just shake, it triggers. It liquefies the ground, which fails the tanks, which releases the gas, which a still summer day then holds in place over the people least able to flee. It is the same chain reaction, the same engineered catastrophe stacked on top of the natural one, the same reason the aftermath may be worse than the quake. But here is what should truly unsettle you. Everything I have just described, the fire and the gas and the thousands of additional deaths, came from modelling only 4 facilities. 4. And those 4 are not the whole story. They are barely the beginning of it. Part 11. 70 sites and counting. When the research team built their terrifying picture of fire and toxic clouds, they were not looking at the entire hub. They were not even looking at most of it. They modelled just 4 industrial facilities in North Portland. And from those 4 alone came the river fire, the threatened 70,000, the lingering gas, the 2,500 dead. Now hold that number, 4, in your mind, and brace yourself for the next one. In the course of that same work, the researchers identified roughly 70 high-risk sites. 70. Most of them sitting on the same kind of liquefiable soil, the same loose, saturated riverbank ground that turns to liquid under a great earthquake. And that count of 70 is only around Portland. It is one city, one stretch of one river. The modelling that produced all that horror covered just 4 of those 70 sites, which means the full scale of the threat in Portland alone is many times larger than the already nightmarish scenario the team was able to detail. Every one of those additional sites is its own potential spill, its own potential fire, its own potential cloud, and the great majority of them are sitting on ground that will not hold when the shaking comes. And then widen the lens further, because Portland is not unique. The same logic, the same kind of vulnerable industrial infrastructure built on the same kind of soft riverside ground, can be found throughout the Pacific Northwest. Seattle has its own industrial waterfront on its own questionable soil. So do the smaller cities and the ports up and down the coast. The hub along the Willamette is the clearest and most studied example, but it is an example, not an exception. The pattern repeats wherever people built heavy hazardous industry next to the water, which is to say almost everywhere that matters. This is the moment where the scale of the thing becomes almost too large to hold in your head. So let me bring it back to the single idea that makes sense of all of it. We built our most dangerous infrastructure, the fuel and the poison and the heavy industry, on the worst possible ground during the centuries when we did not know the fault was there. The silence did not just hide the earthquake, it shaped where we put the things that, when the earthquake comes, will turn one disaster into a dozen. 70 sites in one city is not bad luck. It is the predictable result of 100 years of building in the dark. Naming it that way is not an accusation. It is an orientation. If the exposure was built by a long sequence of understandable choices made without knowledge, then it can be unbuilt by a sequence of deliberate choices made with knowledge. The same human decisions that concentrated the danger can be turned to dispersing it, hardening it, moving it off the worst ground. The 100 years of building in the dark is finished. What we build now, we build in the light, with the fault mapped and the cascade understood, and that changes what kind of future is still available to choose. And the consequences do not stay neatly inside the disaster zone, because a modern economy is a web, and Cascadia would tear out one of its largest strands. The Pacific Northwest is not some isolated corner. Its ports are among the busiest in the country, gateways for goods moving between Asia and the whole interior of the continent. Its tech industry, its aerospace manufacturing, its agriculture, its shipping, all plug into the national and global economy. When the region's fuel supply collapses, its ports are wrecked, its bridges are down, and its power is out for months. The damage radiates outward far beyond the people directly harmed. Supply chains that run through the region seize up. Goods that move through its ports pile up or reroute at enormous cost. The economic shockwave of the costliest natural disaster in American history would be felt in places that never shook at all. That wider exposure is also, quietly, an argument for hope, because it means the whole country has a stake in getting this right, not just the people on the coast. The cost of hardening the hub, retrofitting the bridges, and strengthening the buildings is large, but it is a fraction of the cost of losing them all at once with no preparation. Every dollar spent making the region more resilient is a dollar that does not have to be spent many times over, digging out from a preventable collapse. The 70 sites are a warning, but they are also a to-do list. Each one that gets hardened or relocated is one less link in the chain reaction, one less spill, one less fire, one less cloud. The scale of the problem is daunting, but it is finite, and it is known, which is exactly what makes it solvable. There is one more detail from the research that deserves a hard look, because it adds a layer of dread that is different in kind from the rest. When the team went looking for the full picture of what is stored at these sites, they ran into a wall. It became clear early on, one of them said, that there is information that is missing. The records of exactly what hazardous materials are kept at these facilities and in what quantities are incomplete. We do not fully know what is out there, and that uncertainty is not a comfort. It is the opposite. It means the scenarios the researchers built, as frightening as they are built on partial information. The real inventory could be worse than what they were able to model. When you're estimating how many people a toxic cloud might kill, missing data does not make the number smaller. It makes the true number unknowable, and the unknown in a situation like this almost always cuts against you. Think about what that means for the people living near these sites. They cannot fully assess their own risk, because the basic facts about what is stored next door are not fully on the books. They are living beside a hazard whose true size is partly hidden, on ground that will betray them in the shaking downwind of chemicals that a still summer day will hold in place over their homes. And this is precisely the kind of gap that feeds the suspicion, common in communities near these facilities, that someone somewhere is hiding how bad it really is. We will come back to that suspicion later, because it deserves an honest answer rather than a dismissal, but the simple documented fact is that the inventory is incomplete, and that incompleteness is itself a risk. So that is the man made half of the catastrophe. The fuel, the fire, the gas, the 70 sites, the missing records, all of it set off by the same locked fault releasing the same stored strain. And you might think that would be the end of the ways this earthquake can hurt the people of the coast. But there is one more, and it does not end when the fires burn out or the gas disperses. It is permanent. Because when the fault slips, it does not just shake the land, it drops it. And the coastline that drops in those few minutes does not come back up. The thread we have followed from a silent fault to a city in flames now leads to the water's edge, where the ground itself is about to sink and stay sunk for generations. Part 12. The coast that drops 6 feet. Everything we have talked about so far, the shaking and the wave and the fire and the gas, eventually ends. The ground stops moving. The water pulls back. The fires, given enough time, burn themselves out, and the toxic clouds finally disperse on the wind. But there is one consequence of the Cascadia earthquake that does not end. It does not pass. It is permanent, written into the coastline itself, and it will outlast everyone alive when it happens. When the fault slips, the land along the coast does not just shake, it sinks, and it stays sunk. To understand why, we have to go back to the two plates and what they have been doing to each other during all those centuries of silence. Remember that the Juan de Fuca plate is diving down beneath the North American plate. As it does, it drags and bends the edge of the continent. Because the fault is locked, the leading edge of North America gets pushed and squeezed, and part of that edge is actually forced upward. The coastline of the Pacific Northwest is very slowly being lifted, bulged up by the pressure of the locked fault beneath it. It is like pressing your hand down on the edge of a thick rug and watching the rug bunch up and rise just ahead of your hand. The land is being held in a raised, strained position by the force of the collision. Scientists can actually watch this happening right now, in real time, which is part of how they know what is coming. Using precise satellite positioning, the kind of technology that lets a receiver measure its location to within a fraction of an inch, researchers have planted instruments all along the coast and tracked their movement year after year. And what those instruments show is the coast being squeezed and lifted, the land tilting and bulging inland as the locked fault drags it. The Pacific Northwest is very slowly being deformed like clay under a thumb, the ground storing the strain visibly, measurably, in numbers that accumulate on a screen. We are not guessing that the fault is loaded, we are watching it load. That is one of the few genuinely reassuring things in this entire story, oddly enough. We are not blind to this anymore. The instruments that show the coast bending are the same ones that will, in the end, help refine the warnings and the building codes and the evacuation maps. The silence fooled the people who built these cities, but it does not fool the science any longer. We can see the strain accumulating in numbers on a screen, which means that for the first time in the long history of this fault, the people living above it have the chance to act on knowledge the earlier generations never had. The cruel twist is how this has hidden the danger of the rising sea. Along much of this coast, the slow uplift from the straining fault has been lifting the land at roughly the same pace the ocean has been rising, so that local sea level has looked almost stable. People living there have not watched the water climb the way coastal communities elsewhere have. It has felt, falsely, like one of the places the rising ocean was sparing. But that apparent stability is borrowed entirely against the earthquake. The land is only keeping pace with the sea because it is being held up by strain that must, eventually, release. The day it releases, the borrowed elevation is repaid in an instant, and decades of hidden sea level rise arrive all at once as the ground falls away. So the subsidence is not really a separate disaster from the climate story. It is the climate story, fast-forwarded and made violent. The patient, creeping threat that coastal cities everywhere are trying to plan for over the coming century gets delivered to this particular coast in a single afternoon, with no time to adapt, no time to retreat, no time to raise a single structure or move a single road. One moment the coastline is where the maps say it is. The next, after the shaking finally stops, the maps are wrong, permanently, and a region that thought the rising sea was someone else's problem discovers it has arrived all at once. Now here is a subtle thing that has actually been masking a danger. That slow uplift, over the recent decades, has been quietly working against sea level rise. As the oceans have risen with the warming climate, the coastline of the Pacific Northwest has, in some places, been rising too, lifted by the strained fault. So the local effect of rising seas has been partly offset. The water came up, but so did the land, and the two roughly cancelled. It has made the sea level threat along this coast look gentler than it really is. But that arrangement is a debt, not a gift. The land is only up there because the fault is locked and straining, and when the fault finally releases, that debt comes due all at once. When the earthquake hits, the locked edge of the continent that has been bulged upwards suddenly snaps the other way. The strain releases, the bulge collapses, and the land drops. This sudden downward drop is called subsidence, and along parts of the Cascadia coast, the land could subside by up to 6 feet in the space of those few minutes of shaking. 6 feet. Picture the ground you're standing on dropping by the height of a tall man permanently in minutes. The land that was lifted over centuries falls in moments, and it does not climb back. To feel how disorienting that is, imagine standing on a familiar beach the day after if you could. The horizon looks the same, the hills behind you look the same, but the line where the water meets the land has crept inland permanently, and the tide now reaches places it never used to touch, lapping at foundations and roadbeds that stood safely dry the day before. There was no slow erosion, no season of storms to explain it. The land simply dropped, in the same few minutes that everything else was breaking, and what dropped will stay dropped for longer than anyone alive will see. It is one of the few natural processes that can permanently rewrite a coastline faster than a person can run from it. It will take centuries of slow tectonic strain to lift it again, if it ever does. And here is the comparison that reframes the entire climate conversation for this coast. That sudden 6-foot drop is roughly equivalent to a few centuries of climate-driven sea level rise, compressed into the span of a single earthquake. Everything that scientists worry the oceans might do to these shores over the next 200 or 300 years, the slow, creeping inundation, the gradual loss of the lowest ground, Cascadia can do in an afternoon. It is not a slow creep. It is a step change. 1 minute the coastline is where it has always been, and the next, after the shaking stops, the sea is permanently several feet higher against the land because the land itself has fallen to meet it. And this connects straight back to the core of everything we have been building toward. We talked about how the cities were built during the silence, on soft ground near the water, before anyone knew the fault was there. The subsidence is the final betrayal of that choice. All of that low-lying development, the neighborhoods and businesses and roads and infrastructure that crowd the waterfront, was placed at a certain height above the sea. The earthquake reaches up and lowers that height all at once everywhere along the coast, and there is nothing anyone can do in the moment to stop it. The same fault whose silence let us build in those places is the fault that drops them into the reach of the tides. What does that actually do to a coastline? It does not just flood a few beaches temporarily. It redraws the maps of where flooding can happen, permanently. Land that used to sit safely above the high tide line is now at or below it. Places that flooded only in the worst storms now flood in ordinary ones. Areas that never flooded at all join the floodplain for the first time, and they never leave it. The coastline does not recover from this the way it recovers from a storm. The storm passes and the water leaves. The subsidence does not pass. The new lower coastline is simply the coastline now, and the people who live there wake up, if they survive everything else, to a world where the water has moved permanently inland. This is why the researchers studying Cascadia have started to treat the earthquake not only as a sudden catastrophe, but as a permanent transformation of the land. The fire and the gas are acute, terrible, but temporary. The subsidence is chronic. It is the wound that does not close. And when you combine it with the other great slow force acting on these shores, the rising of the seas themselves, you get a compounding threat that depends entirely on a single question. Not whether the earthquake will lower the coast. We know it will. The question is how high the ocean has already risen by the time it happens. Because the later the earthquake comes, the more the sea will have already climbed, and the worse that sudden 6-foot drop becomes. Timing, it turns out, is everything, and the longer the fault waits in its silence, the deeper the hole it digs for the coast. Part 13. The floodplains that never drain. Once you understand that the coast drops and stays dropped, the next question writes itself. How much new land does that put underwater, and how many people does it put in harm's way? And the answer reveals a trap that gets worse the longer the fault holds its breath. When researchers modelled the effect of that sudden subsidence, they found that the floodplains across the region, the zones where flooding can occur, would expand by up to 115 square miles, and not temporarily, permanently. 115 square miles of new flood zone, created in the minutes of the earthquake and never reclaimed. That is a staggering amount of newly vulnerable territory, and it is filled with exactly what you would expect on developed coastal land. Homes, businesses, roads, the infrastructure that people depend on every single day. All of it, in an instant, moved from dry ground into a place where the water can now reach it, again and again, for the rest of its existence. The researchers put a number on the human cost of that expansion, and it is brutal in its simplicity. That growth of the floodplain would basically double the flood exposure of people, of structures, and of roads in the affected areas. Double. Twice as many people living where the water can reach them. Twice as many buildings in the flood zone. Twice as many roads that wash out, that strand communities, that fail just when people need them most. And this is on top of everything else. The same coastline that just endured the shaking, the wave, the fire, and the gas now finds that its long-term flooding problem has been permanently doubled by the same event. The disaster does not just kill on the day it happens. It reaches forward into every year that follows, raising the water against the survivors over and over. But here is where the trap closes, and where the timing becomes everything. Sea levels are already rising slowly, year by year, as the climate warms. That slow rise is already, on its own, expanding floodplains and pushing the water higher against the coast, with or without any earthquake. So now imagine the two threats meeting. Imagine the earthquake does not strike tomorrow, but instead holds off, in its silence, until later this century, until a year like 2100. By then, the sea will already be significantly higher than it is today. The floodplains will already have grown on their own, the water will already have advanced, and then, on top of that already higher sea and those already expanded flood zones, the earthquake finally hits and the land drops its 6 feet all at once. The subsidence does not start from today's coastline. It starts from the higher, more flooded coastline that climate change has already produced. The sudden drop stacks on top of the slow rise, and when the researchers modelled that combination, the later earthquake landing on the higher future sea, the doubling became a tripling. The flood exposure of people, structures and roads would not just double, it would triple. The longer the fault waits, the worse the flooding outcome becomes, because every year of waiting is a year the ocean climbs a little higher, loading more water onto the coast that the earthquake is eventually going to drop. Let that sink in, because it inverts the way we usually think about waiting for a disaster. Normally, when something dangerous is overdue, we feel a kind of grim relief with every year it does not happen. Another year survived. Another year of safety. We treat the passage of time as if it were drawing down the danger, as if each calm year subtracts a little from the threat. For most overdue hazards, that instinct is roughly right. But Cascadia paired with a rising ocean breaks the instinct entirely, because here 2 clocks are running at once. One is the fault, loading toward a rupture that grows no gentler with delay. The other is the sea, climbing a little higher every year, loading more water onto the exact coastline the fault is going to drop. Waiting does nothing to ease the first clock and actively worsens the second. The longer the quiet lasts, the higher the ocean sits when the land finally falls, and the more catastrophic the permanent flooding becomes. But with Cascadia and the rising seas, waiting does not buy safety. In this one specific and cruel way, waiting makes it worse. For the communities living on the lowest ground, this changes the nature of the decision they face, turning it from a question about one bad day into a question about the whole future of where they live. A home that sits comfortably above the water today may sit at the edge of a permanent floodplain after the quake, or below it. Roads that connect a town to the rest of the world may wash out repeatedly once the land has dropped. Some places that are livable now may simply not be livable in the same way afterward, not because of a single flood, but because the baseline has moved against them for good. This is the hardest part of the whole story to sit with, because it cannot be fixed with a stronger building or a better tank. You cannot retrofit the elevation of the land itself. What you can do is plan for it honestly, before it happens, rather than discovering it in the wreckage. Knowing which ground will subside, which neighbourhoods will join the floodplain, and which routes will be cut allows communities to make hard choices deliberately about where to rebuild and where not to, about which critical facilities to move to higher ground now, while there is still time to choose. That kind of foresight is not defeatism. It is the opposite. It is refusing to be blindsided twice by the same fault, first by the shaking, and then by a permanently altered coast that no one planned for. The silence hid the earthquake from the people who built these towns. We do not have that excuse. We can see the dropped coastline coming, and seeing it coming is the one advantage those earlier generations never had. Every quiet year is a year the flooding consequence grows, because the sea keeps rising underneath the land that the fault will eventually drop. The silence we have talked about from the very beginning is not neutral. It is actively compounding the cost of the flooding year after year in the background, while we go about our lives forgetting the fault is there. And this is the same pattern, the same thread, that has run through this entire story, now extended into the far future. The shaking breaks the water main so the fires cannot be fought. The liquefaction spills the fuel that feeds those fires. The same liquefaction fails the chemical tanks that release the cloud, and the same rupture that does all of that drops the coastline into the rising sea, permanently, doubling and potentially tripling the flood exposure of everyone who survives the first day. It is one event, one fault, releasing one store of strain built up over 325 years of silence, and the consequences fan out from that single moment into fire, into poison, into a permanently flooded coast, and into a future that gets worse the longer the wait. So by now you may be feeling something close to despair. The shaking, the tsunami, the river of fire, the invisible cloud, the 70 sites, the sinking coast, the tripling floods. It can sound like a sentence with no appeal, a doom with no exit. And if that were the whole story, this would be a very dark place to leave you. But it is not the whole story. Because there is one more comparison to make, one more country that faced almost exactly this threat and chose to do something about it. And the gap between what they did and what we have done is the single most important number in this entire video. It is the gap between a disaster you endure and a disaster you survive, and it is measured, almost unbelievably, in 1,000 years. Part 14. 1,000 years behind. In modern times, earthquakes are the most deadly natural hazard on the planet. They hit suddenly, without warning, and their death tolls can be staggering, climbing into the tens and hundreds of thousands in a matter of minutes. And when you look at where the most deadly earthquakes have struck throughout history, the grim record belongs overwhelmingly to Asia. The great killers, the quakes that erased entire cities and took hundreds of thousands of lives, have happened again and again across that part of the world. The United States so far has been spared those horrifying numbers. The deadliest earthquake in American history remains the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, which claimed around 3,000 lives. And here is a detail from that disaster that should sound familiar by now, because it is the entire thesis of this video in miniature. Most of those 3,000 people did not die from the shaking. They died from the fire that followed. The quake broke the gas lines and the water mains, fires broke out across the city, and with the water system destroyed, there was no way to fight them. San Francisco did not burn because of the earthquake directly. It burned because of what the earthquake set in motion, and because the city could not respond. More than a century ago, the secondary disaster, the fire, killed far more people than the shaking did. We have known this pattern for over 100 years. Cascadia is that same pattern, scaled up to a magnitude 9, with fuel tanks and chemical plants added to the fire. So the West Coast has been lucky. But that luck is a function of timing, not safety. Because the West Coast is due for a quake far larger than 1906, the largest the United States as we know it has ever seen. And it carries that one unique and deadly quality we keep returning to. It is silent. It does not give the steady warnings that have, over generations, taught other regions to fear and prepare for the ground. To see what preparation actually looks like, you only have to look across the Pacific, to the country whose paperwork told us when the last Cascadia quake struck, Japan. Because a full Cascadia rupture could rival the 2011 disaster in Tohoku, Japan, one of the most expensive natural disasters in the history of the world. The Tohoku earthquake and the tsunami that followed it were a near twin of what Cascadia will do, a great subduction megathrust quake driving a massive wave onto a developed coast, and the comparison is the most important one in this entire story because of a single difference between the two. They were prepared, we are not. Japan has spent generations building for this exact threat. Seawalls, tsunami evacuation routes drilled into schoolchildren, building codes written for great subduction earthquakes and enforced for decades, early warning systems, a culture that remembers, that expects the ground to move and the sea to rise, and that has engineered its cities around that expectation. Tohoku was a horrific disaster even so, because no preparation is perfect against a force that large. But the preparation saved an enormous number of lives, and it meant that when the shaking stopped, the country had the systems and the readiness to respond. Look at what that preparation actually consists of, because it is the picture of what the Pacific Northwest does not yet have. Japan has built towering seawalls along stretches of its coast, designed and engineered specifically for tsunamis. It runs a nationwide early warning system that can detect the first, faster-moving waves of an earthquake and send alerts to phones, trains and factories in the seconds before the heavy shaking arrives, seconds that are enough to stop a bullet train or shut a gas valve. It enforces some of the strictest seismic building codes on Earth, refined over decades and applied relentlessly. And perhaps most importantly, it has woven the expectation of earthquakes into the culture itself, with regular drills, with evacuation routes marked and practiced, with schoolchildren who know exactly where to go and what to do because they have rehearsed it many times. The Pacific Northwest, by comparison, is only beginning. There is no comparable seawall system guarding its coast. Early warning is in its infancy compared to what Japan fields. A great deal of the building stock predates modern codes, and the public habit of drilling and preparing is nowhere near as ingrained. This is what the expert meant by 1,000 years behind. It is not that the science is unknown here, or that the engineering is impossible. It is that the sustained society-wide commitment that Japan made over generations has barely started in a region facing a nearly identical threat. The knowledge arrived late, in the 1980s, and the response is still catching up to the knowledge, and the cost comparison should focus the mind. The Tohoku disaster was one of the most expensive natural disasters in human history, and that was a country that had prepared. The bill for an unprepared region facing the same kind of event does not shrink because we were not ready. It grows. Preparation is not only about saving lives in the moment, though it is mostly about that. It is also about not handing the future an even larger reckoning, a longer blackout, a slower recovery, a deeper economic wound that takes years longer to heal because nothing was hardened in advance. Japan showed that the disaster can be survived and recovered from. The open question for the Pacific Northwest is whether it will choose to learn that lesson before the test, or only after it. Now hear how one expert on the Pacific Northwest described where that region stands by comparison. In the Pacific Northwest, he said, we are roughly 1,000 years behind Japan in our preparedness. 1,000 years! That is not a figure of speech tossed off for effect. It is a sober assessment of the chasm between what Japan has built and what the West Coast has not. Where Japan has seawalls and drilled evacuation routes and enforced seismic codes, the Pacific Northwest has old buildings on soft ground, fuel tanks from before 1970, 70 unmodelled high-risk sites in a single city, and an inventory of stored poisons that is not even fully written down. The threat is nearly identical. The readiness could hardly be more different, and this is where I have to address the questions that always rise up around a threat this large, because they deserve honest answers rather than a wave of the hand. When people first learn about the hub, about the missing data, about how exposed they really are, a very natural suspicion takes hold. They start to wonder whether someone is hiding how bad it really is, and I want to be straight with you about that, because there is a real kernel of truth tangled up in it. The researchers themselves found that information was missing, that the records of what is stored at these sites are incomplete. That gap is real. But the honest reading of it is not a grand cover-up. It is something more ordinary and in its own way more frustrating. It is bureaucratic neglect, fractured record-keeping, a system that never bothered to fully account for the danger, because the fault stayed silent and no one was forced to look. And notice who actually brought all of this to light. It was independent researchers, scientists doing the modelling and publishing the results, the very opposite of a secret being kept. The truth here is not hidden. It is being shouted by the people who study it. The failure is that we have not listened, and listening in the end costs so much less than not listening. The research is published, the maps are drawn, the vulnerable buildings and tanks and bridges are identified. None of the hard intellectual work of seeing the disaster coming remains to be done. It has been done and handed to us by people who lost sleep over it so that we would not have to be surprised. What remains is only the will to act on what we already know, which is at once the simplest part and somehow the part we keep deferring. The other question that always comes is whether any of this can be predicted, or whether it could even be triggered on purpose. You will find no shortage of claims online that great earthquakes are set off by solar storms, by planetary alignments, or by secret weapons and antenna arrays meant to manipulate the Earth. And I understand the appeal of those ideas, because they offer something the truth does not. They offer a culprit, and the comforting illusion that if something is being triggered, it could also be stopped or foreseen. But the science does not support any of it. Cascadia's clock is not set by the sun or by any machine. It is set by the slow, relentless convergence of two tectonic plates and the strain that builds as they stay locked together. The sun has been quiet, and the fault does not care. There is no signal that lets us predict the day it will break, and there is no switch anyone can flip to set it off. The energy is geological, built over centuries, and it will release on its own schedule, indifferent to us entirely, and there is a strange kind of clarity in that indifference, once you stop fighting it. We spend so much energy looking for someone to blame for disasters, or for a secret pattern that would let us see them coming, that we sometimes miss the obvious power we actually have. We cannot argue with the plates, we cannot negotiate with the strain, but we were never going to be able to do those things anyway. What we can do is everything that happens on our side of the equation, before the fault ever moves, and that turns out to be almost everything that determines how many people live and die. The fault writes the first sentence of the disaster. We write all the rest in the decades beforehand through every choice about what we build and where and how strong. The earthquake is nature's. The catastrophe is ours, and so is the chance to make it smaller. And in a strange way, accepting that is the first real step toward doing something about it. as long as we are looking for someone to blame or some signal to watch for, we are not doing the thing that actually matters. Because here is the truth that the 1,000-year gap with Japan points to. This is not an unsolvable problem. It is a known one. We know the fault is there. We know roughly what it will do. We have now mapped, in unsettling detail, the cascade of fire and poison and flooding that follows. The earthquake is not the thing we have failed at. The preparation is, and preparation, unlike the fault, is entirely within our control. So before we close this out, let us talk about what closing that 1,000-year gap actually looks like, both for the cities and for you personally. Because the most important part of this whole story is the part that proves the doom is a choice, not a fate. Part 15. What actually saves you? So should everyone living within 100 miles of the Pacific Northwest coast simply pack up and find somewhere else to live? It is a fair question, after everything we have walked through. But the answer is no, and the reason matters. There is nowhere on Earth that is free of risk of some kind, and more to the point, this particular danger is one we actually know how to solve. The horror of the Cascadia scenario is not that it is unstoppable, it is that we have not yet bothered to stop it, and that means the same facts that make it terrifying also make it fixable. Start with the engineering, because the single most dangerous piece of this whole story, the fuel and chemical infrastructure on the river, is also one of the most straightforwardly solvable. We know, with confidence, that modern fuel tanks built to the appropriate seismic codes can be designed to withstand this magnitude of shaking. The reason the hub is a catastrophe is not that it is impossible to build tanks that survive a great earthquake. It is that these particular tanks were built before we knew the earthquake was coming, to standards that predate the knowledge. Newer construction, built to modern codes, can resist the shaking, which means the river of fire and the toxic cloud are not laws of nature. They are the consequence of old infrastructure that has not yet been replaced or reinforced, and every tank that gets retrofitted or rebuilt to current standards is a piece of that nightmare being switched off in advance. And that is a genuinely hopeful way to think about an otherwise grim subject, because it means the worst version of this disaster is not fixed in stone. It is a setting that can still be changed. Every retrofit, every relocated tank, every reinforced bridge and hardened waterline shaves something off the toll of the eventual quake, quietly, years before it happens. The fault will rupture no matter what. But the size of the catastrophe that follows is still, right now, partly in our hands. The same is true across the board. There is a great deal of work to be done to retrofit the buildings, the bridges, and the critical infrastructure of the Pacific Northwest, but it is work that can be done. Bridges can be strengthened. Old buildings can be reinforced or replaced. Water systems can be made more resilient so that there is something in the pipes to fight the fires. Fuel and chemical storage can be moved off the worst ground or hardened against it. None of this is mysterious. The engineering exists. Japan has already done much of it. The 1,000-year gap is not a gap in knowledge. It is a gap in will and investment, and that is a gap a society can choose to close whenever it decides the threat is worth taking seriously. But retrofitting cities takes years and money and political will, and you, as a single person watching this, cannot pour the concrete yourself. So what can you actually do? And here is where the answer genuinely surprised me, because it is not what you might expect. Yes, you should know the basics. If you live in the inundation zone, understand that a long, strong earthquake is your only tsunami warning and that you move to high ground on foot, immediately. Have the supplies, the water, the food, the things you would put in a go bag to get through the days when there is no power and no open store. Those things matter. But the experts who study disaster survival point to something less obvious, and, it turns out, more powerful than any kit you can buy. Before we get to that, let me put a finer point on the supplies, because the standard advice has quietly shifted in a way most people have not heard. For years, the guidance was to keep about 3 days of food and water on hand, the assumption being that official help would reach you within 72 hours. For a disaster on the scale of Cascadia, that assumption collapses. With bridges down, roads buckled, ports damaged, and the entire region hit at once, outside help may not reach many communities for a week, 2 weeks, or longer. So the new guidance from emergency planners in the Pacific Northwest is to be ready to be on your own for at least 2 weeks, and ideally more. Water above all, because you can go without almost anything else longer than you can go without water, and the taps may be dry for months. Food that needs no refrigeration and little cooking. Medications, a way to stay warm, a way to get information when the power and the towers are down. But here is the thing the supply lists tend to obscure. You cannot stockpile your way out of a disaster this large. 2 weeks of water in the garage is a start, not a solution, when the power is out for 6 months to a year and the normal systems of life have all failed at once. At that scale, survival stops being about what you individually have stored and starts being about something you cannot buy at all, which brings us back to the answer the disaster researchers keep landing on. The single most important thing you can do is get to know your neighbours. That is the finding, stated plainly by the people who have studied how communities live or die in the aftermath. When the official response cannot reach you for days or weeks, the people who will actually pull you from the rubble, share their water, splint your arm, and check on the elderly man down the street are the people who were already around you when the ground moved. The neighbour who turns out to be a nurse, the one with a ham radio who can reach the outside world when the cell network is gone, the one who knows which houses have children or someone who cannot walk. When you already know the people nearby, you know what they might need from you, and they know what they might need from you in return, and in the hours after a catastrophe those skills and that knowledge are offered freely, without being asked. The single most important thing you can do to survive the aftermath of a disaster like this is to get to know your neighbours. That is it. That is the answer from the people who have studied how communities live or die in the days after a catastrophe. Because when the shaking stops and the power is out and the bridges are down, and the official help cannot reach you for days, the people who are actually going to save your life are the ones already standing around you. The neighbour who happens to be a nurse, the one who has a ham radio and can reach the outside world when the cell towers are down, the one who knows that an elderly person 2 doors down cannot get out on their own. When you know the people around you, you know a little more about what they might need from you, and they know a little more about what you might need from them, and those skills and that knowledge are given freely in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. This is one of the most consistent findings about how people behave when everything falls apart. After almost any kind of disaster, there is an enormous amount of what researchers call prosocial behaviour. People come together, they dig each other out, they share what they have. The popular image of disaster as every person for themselves, panic and looting and chaos, is mostly a myth. What actually happens, again and again, is that ordinary people become each other's first responders, because they are the only responders available. And the communities that come through best are the ones where people already knew each other before the ground moved, where the web of relationships was already there to catch people when everything else failed. So make a plan. Learn the risk that your home, your school, and your workplace actually face, because the hazard is not the same everywhere, and knowing where you stand is the start of everything else. Talk with your family and your friends about what you would do in different situations, where you would meet, how you would find each other when the phones are down, and then talk to your neighbours, both at home and at work, because in the end they are the network that will hold when the official ones break. None of this requires you to move away from a place you love. It requires you to stop treating the danger as someone else's problem, and start treating it as a thing you and the people around you can prepare for together. The people who come through disasters best are almost never the ones who imagine themselves as lone survivors stockpiling against the world. They are the ones embedded in a web of other people, known and trusted before the crisis ever arrived. Preparation, at its core, is not really about gear. It is about relationships and knowledge, and a plan shared among people who will actually be standing near each other when the ground moves. That is something anyone can begin building today, for free, simply by turning toward the people already around them. And that brings us back one last time to the silence where this whole story began. For 325 years that fault has said nothing, and the silence lulled us into building a civilization on top of it as though it were not there. The deadliest thing about Cascadia was never really the shaking, or the wave, or even the fire and the poison and the sinking coast. The deadliest thing was the forgetting. The way a threat that makes no noise slips out of mind, so that when it finally speaks, it finds us unprepared, 1,000 years behind a country that chose to remember. We cannot stop the fault from breaking. That much is fixed, written into the slow grinding of the plates, indifferent to anything we do. But we can decide what kind of world it breaks upon. We can close the gap. We can retrofit the tanks and reinforce the bridges and learn our neighbours' names. The earthquake is not the test. The waiting is. And the only question that actually matters is whether we spend the silence preparing, or whether we spend it the way we always have, pretending the quiet means we are safe.